Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Game of Thrones Overrated? This week we take a look at Season 1, Episode 5. Alright, I'm back this week. Stu, what do you think?
Well, it's got good parts and it's got bad parts.
Oh,
That's what I'll say. Better than last week's episode. Maybe not as good as episode 3. At times, it's better than episode 3.
I would say it's better than Episode 3. I would say that because there's tons of stuff going on. You've got loads of action scenes, you've got lots of really cool exposition, you've got lots of character development.
Mm-hmm.
It's paying off a lot of things, but it's also setting up some more things for the rest of the season. So I've quite enjoyed this week's episode overall.
I would say one of the things that bothers me with some of the scenes that I was seeing in this episode is the repetition. Which now I'm looking at the scenes in the episodes in more detail. Some things just feel like needless repetition, like the scene with Theon and
Roz, I think.
Roz, yes, that's her name.
Yay! Finally named her.
Yeah. Well, Game of Thrones hasn't yet. So, in that scene, again, it's established that Theon is insecure because he's a Greyjoy in Starklands. And that's also addressed in the scene with Bran and Maester Luwin. And this was also a running theme in the previous episode, and the story's not moved on in.
They do seem to be having a bit of a go at Theon, but I can understand his position. I mean, he's been estranged from his family, and he's been raised as a captive, but also a ward. It's an odd relationship he's got with the Starks, and
it is. It's just I feel they established that in episode 4, so they don't need to go back to that well for episode 5.
I guess their mistake was not finding another way to look at that relationship.
Yeah,
like having him actually have a conversation with having him have more of a relationship with Ned would have been quite good, I think, because Ned is an honourable man. So to see a relationship between Ned and Theon actually might be quite beneficial for the story arc.
Yeah, like for instance, in season 6, there is a callback to it when Theon says his real father died in King's Landing, which is obviously a reference to Ned. But we never see that relationship.
Of course.
Like, there's just, Ned barely interacts with him in the first episode, and that's it.
I suppose maybe he doesn't really want to have much of a relationship with him because he's a Greyjoy. But then, he's still raising a child, so he should have taken more responsibility.
This is actually a theme that runs through with Theon, where points are just hammered home a bit much. We'll get on to that later.
Yeah, possible spoilers.
And the thing is, like, I said this with the Dothraki in the previous episode, in the sense that all the scenes in that episode felt like just scenes from a previous episode again, rather than the story moving forward.
Yeah, because we do get some establishment of Viserys being a dick and Daenerys struggling with her position, but finding a way to deal with it in a positive way, in quotation marks.
Because I was actually quite happy we didn't go across the Narrow-Sea this week.
Yeah, same. I was actually quite happy we didn't go to the Wall as well, because the Wall is not the most interesting part a lot of the time. Sometimes when really big things are happening at the Wall, that is when it starts to become some of the most interesting parts of the series.
Also, we got a really good story at the Wall last week, so we didn't need to go back to the Wall.
We definitely got some stuff happening at the Wall, which makes us like the characters at the Wall.
Well, there's a logical progression up there, because that story with Jon and Sam was very much as a result of the interaction between Jon and Theon in episode 3. So I liked how that all built. That's the sign of the story moving on, whereas Theon is pretty much in the same position he was at the start of episode 3. Everyone's just talking about how it's a bit weird for him, his position, and what the Greyjoys are. But there isn't a story. Everyone's just talking about him, or to him, about who he is.
With the exception of the Night's Watch, I'd say, for me, the Greyjoys they're definitely not the strongest in terms of story arc, at least not this early in the series.
I would say what really shocks me, actually, is how much Greyjoy material there is in these first few episodes, because and this is part of my point, actually. I forgot all this stuff by season 2. And it didn't stop me understanding the Greyjoys.
Yeah, they're quite a simple plan, aren't they? Weep not so.
Yeah, they're basically Vikings, that's it.
Yeah, that's their arc. They're
like,
sailors.
Everything about them is established in that scene where Theon talks to Balon and is like, we need to go help the Starks. And Balon's like, no, we won't help them because this is who we are. Done. And that also establishes that Theon's been a ward. Like, you could have had Theon appear there. Now, I know that's not the way it happens in the books, but also, not a lot of time was spent on Theon in book 1. So they didn't need to do this.
Yeah, that's true. But there's still plenty of awesome parts going on. There's lots of all of the fights, for example. Every single fight is big and meaningful. It's not just a fight that's stuck in there for no reason. You've got the Clegane brothers, who may never fight again, or maybe they will fight again. Spoiler. But I thought that was quite a cool fight to start things off.
My single favourite moment in that is when Rob tells them to break it up, and the Hound just drops to his knees instantaneously, which almost results in him losing his head.
Yes.
Because that one beat shows you who the Hound is at the start, anyway.
Yes, he's definitely the more tame of the two dogs, I guess.
I have to say, I'm not as positive about the final fight, which I loved when I first saw it.
The final fight, I know what you mean, because there's something, they take something away from it when you finally see Ned and Jamie fight. Because you think throughout the whole thing, which of those two would actually win in a fight? And
they even set this up in episode 1. Yeah. Because they have that conversation about their fighting styles and why Ned's never in tournament. So this is something they've even built to in the short amount of time they've had. And arguably it feels bigger having gone back and having the whole context of the things Ned has done until this point, and the things Jamie's done until this point.
I feel like it's a very Lannister-y thing, though, to not win a fair fight. And that's sort of a setup for how the Lannisters play all of their games.
Well, see, my criticism isn't actually anything story-related for once, because I would say that the fight works really well. In fact, there's weird shadows of Ned's fight with Arthur Dayne in the fight. Rather than him winning, he's stabbed in the back, which is exactly what happened when Ned fought Arthur Dayne.
Spoiler, by the way.
Yeah. There'll be all sorts of notices. Okay. If you don't want spoilers, you're watching the wrong review series. So I enjoyed that element of it. But what I would say is when you look at the camera work, is the actor that plays Jamie, who I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his name. So I'm just going to say the actor that plays Jamie.
Okay.
Maybe a bit less confident on fight choreography than Sean Bean.
Potentially.
Because that was something I became very aware of when I was watching the scene and looking at how it was shot. Because a lot of the points where contact was about to be made, there was a sudden cutaway, which stopped the fight feeling as urgent. Certainly in comparison to the fight at the start of the episode as well.
I find that's quite a common thing in fights, in TV fights, that cutaways are used a lot to try and make the action seem like it's moving more quickly. But I agree, I find it quite jarring sometimes.
Well, I would say Game of Thrones doesn't really have the most exciting fight choreography of TV series that try to do it. Not to say it's bad, but just not the most exciting. And I would say this is even low by Game of Thrones fans.
Would that not be because Jamie Lannister maybe isn't that confident fighting against Ned Stark?
Well,
because he hasn't seen him fight.
But any time we talk about Jamie, the constant thing is he is the best swordsman in the game.
Well, that's something that Jamie keeps on saying, and that other people keep on saying, but that doesn't necessarily.
He holds up pretty well in that fight with Brienne.
He does, actually.
And Brienne beats everybody.
Brienne beats everyone. I think Brienne probably is the best fighter in the.
Oh yeah, that's something that is. Yeah, that's something that's probably quite well established on the track.
I would like to see Brienne versus the Mountain. That is a fight I'd love
because
to
there's a scene later where Jamie talks about people that could beat him in a fight, and there's only 2 people, and then that logic does hold up throughout the story. But yeah, because it kept cutting away at points, it felt like they were trying to hide actor weaknesses there.
Okay.
And that's fine to do if the actor's not confident, but it does affect the end result of what you see on screen.
That's fair. That's a shame then, because there's potential there for Ned to just look a bit more like the stronger fighter, and maybe because let's face it, Jamie Lannister, he kills what's his name, Jory? The guy in the eye, Jory. He kills Jory by stabbing him in the eye with a cheeky little dagger move. That's not the kind of move someone does if they're a confident swordsman. That's the kind of move they do if they want to just win.
It does if you're a moralless confident swordsman.
Okay.
Which Jamie Lannister definitely is.
Okay, that makes sense.
But yeah, the thing is, and why I think I don't remember this disappointing me, is the story of it's very good. Mm-hmm. So that part really holds up, the way Ned fights compared to the way Jamie fights, because Jamie's a bit more flamboyant and a bit more showy, whereas Ned's just gritty and down to earth, and he can't quite overcome that. Mm. So that all works, and that's why I probably remember it as a good fight. But just when I was looking at the fight choreography of it, I was just like, I feel like that could have been better.
I do feel like the weight of the episode though does lend a lot to it, and you do feel a lot of urgency while you're watching it, because it's the Lannisters and the Starks are finally butting heads properly. And this is one of the big moments where they do that. So I can forgive the fight choreography in that particular sense. Yes. But I agree, it could have been a little bit slicker.
So yeah, like other than that, I don't have like too many major criticisms with this episode. I would say the other one I have is something that I think comes back to some of the points I had previously. Is so we see Varys in the tunnels under King's Landing.
Yes.
Scheming with the guy that was at Daenerys' marriage.
Yes, who we never see again.
First time you watched that, did you realise that was the same guy?
Not quite. I thought I recognised the voice, and I knew it wasn't.
Because his face is mostly in shadow for the whole thing, which I think has a very detrimental effect on the scene. And I think realising that was that guy is very important. But also, I think the reason why it flies under the radar is you never see Varys doing anything like this after this episode.
Yeah, I suppose it establishes that that's the kind of thing he does. And a lot of the...
Because it's basically the reason that Ned doesn't trust Varys, and that's legit, and that's fine, but I just wish they'd done more with it. Because Varys is your big connection across the narrow sea to what's going on over there, because Varys is up to his knees in it.
Yeah.
And they just kind of forget it quite quickly after this, which I think sometimes lets you forget just how duplicitous Varys is, and I wonder sometimes if like Game of Thrones tries too hard to make characters likable.
Well, if you don't make them likable, if you don't make anybody, if you make it hard to root for people, you make the show hard to watch, which I think sometimes can be people's issue with the show, because a lot of the people in the show don't have much of a moral compass, and also the people with a moral compass do tend to end up dead.
Yeah.
It's
because
it's hard to make that balance, I think.
That I address that is the way Cersei is portrayed, particularly compared to the book. They do seem to be going out their way to make her a more sympathetic character. Problem is, you then have to counterpoint that with the character that she eventually becomes.
Yes.
And I still wonder if that holds up, because I think she came across very, very well in the scene with Robert.
Definitely.
But again, it just felt like, where did Cersei leave her brain between seasons 1 and 5 and 6?
I don't know if you'd necessarily
because her
left her
appreciation of geopolitics seemed way better.
I don't know if she'd necessarily left her brain behind. I think Cersei does prioritize her children a lot and her family a lot. So that does tend to overcomplicate any decision that she wants to make in terms of politics. I think that does pretty much decide every decision she makes. So it's hard to make her seem clever whilst also make her protective of her family. Although admittedly, Tyrion still kind of does that.
Well, yeah, and that's what but the thing is, that's very true to the book, whereas they're adding this with Cersei.
Right, okay.
And I'd say, like, some of it's like, well, if you're going to divert from the book, properly commit to it. Like, don't sort of just go, ooh, I'm worried if she's a bit sympathetic. So we'll make her a bit more sympathetic, but still have her doing all the things she does as a character when she's unsympathetic. Like, that to me doesn't quite work.
Okay. Well, anything else? Are we?
I'd like to point out one little reference that I liked.
Yes, do it.
And it was super subtle. When Bob's having his discussion at the small council, which is built up great, like when Renly comes in and goes, my brother's coming, and everyone's like, what? And he says in that scene that when Ned's courting him to do nothing, fear will keep them in line, which is almost word for word what Grand Moff Tarkin...
Fear will keep the local systems in line.
...says at the council meeting on the Death Star when they disband the council.
No, Robert's part of the Empire.
And I thought that was an interesting reference. Because this is a power thing, and the conflict they're having, particularly about how to deal with Daenerys, is a thing that will keep coming back in later series with characters having to make choices like these.
Do you think the Star Wars reference was intentional?
I think it was, yeah.
Yes. Excellent. Okay.
Because basically Bob's having to do something that Ned is telling him is flat out immoral. And usually, in a normal TV series, they just wouldn't do it. But instead, Bob goes, no, you don't know what you're talking about, because we're going to be in trouble if we don't deal with this woman. And I kind of like that, what it's doing with playing with your usual narrative tropes that way.
It's not just a simple moral compass, good versus evil.
They don't go, oh, well, it's a bad idea, so we won't do it. And yeah, I suppose this week I've only got slightly minor points. One thing that I find totally unbelievable, when Arya returns after getting dirty in the tunnels. I'm sorry, there's no other way to say that. The two guards are like, alright, boy, there's no way that she looks like a boy. There's just no way.
I must admit, it doesn't quite. She is quite tomboyish, I guess that's maybe what I'm trying to get at, but it's, I agree. It doesn't necessarily have to be.
I mean, I know that's a thing in the book as well, but just, they could have made her look a bit more boyish in that scene, and that's maybe a hair and makeup thing rather than an actress thing or a casting thing. But it was just like, I actually laughed out loud at it because it was just like, she does not look like a boy.
She gets called boy a lot.
Yeah, and that's something that's maybe a theme. I don't know if there's a point being made there. I'm not sure what it is. I also want to get on to a scene of exposition I really liked.
Stu, you like exposition in a scene?
There was a scene that did it really well.
Who are you? You are not Stu.
The scene between Renly and Loras was great.
Yeah, I like that scene as well.
And the reason for it is, one, it addresses the fact that it's really weird that Renly's two brothers are Stannis and Bob, who he's nothing like. I don't know what's going on there, but going by Game of Thrones' usual tropes, he probably has a different mum or dad. That's not a spoiler. I don't know if that's true. And in the scene, Loras is telling Renly how he is, which would usually be the worst type of exposition. He's doing it as a sexual thing, and that's what makes it work, because it's also semi-seductive, and it's also while he's offering him the Tyrell army to help him become king. So there's lots of things going on all in that one thing, while also giving you lots of information about Renly. Arguably more than any other scene in the whole show. It's probably the first sexposition scene that doesn't feel exploitative as well.
It certainly was a lot better than the one last week.
Because it was actually quite classily cut together.
No, it was a lot better than the one last week with Viserys.
Yeah, like that one with Viserys one was terrible. And the one with Theon and Ros was better, but it still felt like, here's a reason to get a woman's tits on screen.
Yeah.
Rather than, and using that to cover poorly placed exposition. Whereas this one, there was a sex scene going on, but it was cut incredibly classily, and it gave you all the information, and there was also something political going on in the scene as well.
And it showed the relationship between Loras and Renly as well.
No,
even though it kind of already got it.
There's one weird thing I want to bring up with it. Why is the name Tyrell never said during this scene?
Is it? Is it not?
It's not.
No.
He just talks about how his dad has an army, which is true, but they never say the Tyrell name, which is weird, because almost every other house gets name checked in this episode.
I wonder if it's because the Tyrells aren't considered a very strong house at this point.
Well, you look at the way they end season 6. Maybe just the writers don't care about the Tyrells.
Maybe they don't. I mean, to be fair, even the characters in it, spoiler, one of the characters says, growing strong, so it kind of says a lot, even though even the characters don't like their own.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's maybe why. It's not the most important house of the whole thing. I don't think it's going to have much influence on the whole.
It's not a big thing. It just stuck out to me since every other house got name checked. It's like the Tyrells actually become quite important later on.
Yes, it does really. But by this point, I guess.
And this is the first time you spent any time with any one of them. So it just felt really weird to not have them name checked when we're just being constantly told the Greyjoys are this house with a fucking boat.
Spoiler: Stu doesn't like the Greyjoys.
They're as important as a fucking bullet train.
Topical.
Oh.
Okay. Thank you everyone for listening again. We'll see you next week. Bye bye.